If you are black and you have hazel eyes, you have probably heard the theories your whole life that your eyes are the mark of a secret bloodline, that they prove descent from ancient Egyptian royalty, or from the Moors of Spain, or from some hidden noble lineage the history books conveniently left out. The internet is in love with that story, and it is a flattering one. It tells you that you are quietly, secretly chosen, but it is not the truth. The real answer to where those eyes come from is written in your DNA, and science can finally read it. And what it says is less like a fairy tale and a great deal more like a history book. It is harder than the legend, and in the end, it is far more honest and far more yours. Let's start with what we actually know, because the science here is solid and specific, and it cuts straight through the folklore. Researchers have spent 2 decades mapping the genetics of eye color, and the trail leads to a single stretch of chromosome 15 containing 2 neighboring genes, OCA2 and HERC2. And in 2013, a team led by the geneticist Sandra Beleza published a landmark study in the journal PLOS Genetics that is almost perfectly designed to answer our exact question. They studied the people of Cape Verde, an Atlantic island nation born from centuries of West African and European mixing, whose people show the entire range of human eye color, from the darkest brown to pale and light, and they pinned down precisely which genes drive that variation and precisely how it tracks with a person's ancestry. It is one of the only major eye color studies ever done on an African-descended and mixed population instead of a European one, which is what makes it gold for us. Alongside it sits the broad body of research on African-American ancestry, including the large-scale work of Katarzyna Brieg and her colleagues at the genetics company 23andMe. Put it all together and you can finally answer the question with evidence instead of a flattering guess. Where do a black person's hazel eyes really come from? Not from a secret royal lineage, and not from a lost noble bloodline. The honest answer has 3 parts, and they fit together into something far more interesting than the legend. But the very first thing you have to understand, before any of it makes sense, is that your eyes are not actually the color you think they are. Here is the strange physical fact at the root of everything, and almost nobody knows it. There is no hazel pigment in your eyes. There is no green pigment, and there is no blue pigment either. None of those colors exist in the human iris at all. You could take a blue eye apart, cell by cell, and never find a single particle of blue. The only pigment in any human eye is melanin, and melanin is brown. The same brown, in fact, that colors skin and hair. A dark brown eye is simply an iris packed full of melanin, soaking up the light that hits it. So where do blue, green, and hazel eyes come from if there is no blue or green or hazel pigment anywhere to make them? They come from physics. When an iris holds only a little melanin, the light entering it gets scattered by the colorless tissue in the front layer, and the short blue wavelengths scatter back out toward the viewer the most. It is the very same effect that makes the daytime sky look blue, even though the sky is not painted blue and contains no blue substance at all, just air, scattering sunlight. Scientists call this structural color. Your eyes are not colored the way a wall is colored with pigment laid down to match. They are colored the way the sky and the ocean are colored, by the way light bends and bounces through a nearly colorless material. It is why a baby's eyes can look blue at birth before browning over as melanin builds in, and why light eyes can seem to change shade depending on the light around them. The color is an event, not a substance. So all of human eye color, the entire range from the darkest brown to the palest blue, really comes down to a single variable: how much melanin sits in the front of your iris. Pack it full, and your eyes are brown. Strip it down to almost nothing, and the scattering takes over, and the eyes read as blue. Leave a moderate, in-between amount, sometimes with a touch of a separate yellowish pigment called lipochrome layered over it, and you get the shifting, half brown, half green, gold fleck color that we call hazel. Hazel is the dial set squarely in the middle, which means the real genetic question was never what makes an eye hazel. It is the deeper question: What turns the melanin down in the first place? That dimmer switch is the first piece of the answer, and it lives in that OCA2 and HERC2 region. There is a particular spot in the HERC2 gene. Geneticists know it by the unglamorous label RRS 129133832 that works like a master dimmer switch for melanin in the iris. It does not make pigment itself. It controls how loudly a neighboring gene, OCA2, gets to speak. In its original ancestral setting, this switch lets OCA2 run at full power. The iris fills with melanin and the eyes come out brown. That is the default setting for the overwhelming majority of human beings who have ever lived, and it is the setting carried by nearly everyone whose ancestry is entirely African. Brown is not just the most common human eye color. It is very close to the only one humanity had for most of our history. Every other color is a recent footnote written in the margins of a long brown story. But a flipped version of that switch dials the melanin production down. When someone inherits the dim version, OCA2 goes quiet. The iris fills with far less pigment, the light scattering takes over, and the eyes lighten toward green, hazel, or blue. A second nearby variant inside the OCA2 gene itself nudges eyes specifically toward the green and hazel middle of the range. These two settings, on that one small stretch of chromosome 15, are the heart of the whole thing. The entire mystery of light eyes, every blue iris and every hazel one on Earth, comes down to which versions of these switches a person inherited. And that raises the only question that actually matters for our story. If you are black and your switches are set to the dim, light eye version, where did that version come from? And how did it reach you? And for most black people in America with hazel eyes, the honest answer is the first hard truth of this story, the one the flattering legend was specifically built to hide. It does not involve a crown. It involves a migration, a system of bondage, and the simple, traceable movement of a single switch on a single chromosome from one population into another. The light eye switches are rare in African populations and common in European ones. So when those settings show up in an African American, the most common explanation, by a wide margin, is admixture, European ancestry that entered the family line somewhere in the past and brought the dim switch with it. This is not speculation. It is exactly what the Cape Verde study showed in black and white. In a population built from centuries of African and European mixing, eye color tracked closely with the proportion of European ancestry a person carried. The lighter the eyes, the more European ancestry, on average, stood behind them. The specific genes responsible were the European-derived versions of those OCA2 and HERC2 switches carried in on the European side of the family tree. And the broader research on African Americans tells the very same story at the level of a whole population. Black Americans carry, on average, somewhere around a quarter European ancestry, the accumulated legacy of generations of mixing since the first ships arrived. For most African Americans with hazel or green or blue eyes, that European ancestry is simply where the dimmer switch came from. It is the plain genetic mechanics of the thing, but you cannot tell that story honestly and then stop there, because the obvious next question is the one that matters most. Where did that European ancestry actually come from? And the answer is the hardest part of this entire subject, the part that no flattering legend will ever touch. The substantial European ancestry carried by Black Americans today is, in large part, the genetic record of slavery itself, of generations in which enslaved Black women lived entirely under the power of the white men who legally owned them, with no right to refuse, and of the children born from that coercion and folded into the enslaved community. That is the truth the comfortable myth is engineered to avoid. For a great many Black families, those hazel eyes did not come down from an ancient African king or a hidden royal line. They came from a slaveholder, written into the body of a child, and then passed down, generation after generation, as a permanent physical trace of the very history this country works hardest to forget. It can be a painful thing to sit with, but the eyes are real history, not fantasy. They are simply not the history the legend was selling. But here is where the science refuses to let the story stay that simple. And this is the part that gives the truth back its dignity. It would be easy, after all that, to conclude that light eyes in a black person are simply European, a borrowed trait, a sign of dilution, something imported from outside. That conclusion is wrong, and the genetics are clear about why. Because light eyes are not, in fact, exclusively European at all. Blue and light eyes occur naturally in some African populations that carry little or no recent European admixture. They have been documented in parts of the Horn of Africa, among people in Ethiopia and Somalia, and in scattered individuals elsewhere on the continent, arising from Africa's own deep and ancient genetic variation rather than from any European ancestor. This should not be surprising once you know the most important fact in all of human genetics. Africa contains more human genetic diversity than the entire rest of the world combined. Every population outside Africa descends from a relatively small band that left, carrying only a slice of the whole. The people who stayed kept the fuller range of human variation in their gene pool. Africa was never a place of one single look, one skin tone, one face, one eye color. That is a flattening imposed from outside. It holds the widest spectrum of human appearance anywhere on Earth, and that spectrum includes light eyes that owe nothing whatsoever to Europe. Two people on the same African street can be more genetically different from each other than a European is from an East Asian. The idea that a light eye must be a foreign import collapses the moment you grasp how much variation Africa held all along. And the deepest layer goes back further still, and it overturns the story most people have been told. For years, the popular version was that every blue eye on the planet traces to a single light-eyed ancestor who lived in Europe 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. It is a tidy, repeatable factoid, and newer work on ancient DNA has badly complicated it. The genetic change behind light eyes now appears to be far older than that. Old enough that some researchers trace the variant back toward the great migration of modern humans out of Africa itself tens of thousands of years ago, long before anyone settled the European peninsula. In other words, the potential for light eyes may well have walked out of Africa with our species in the very beginning, carried in the same human gene pool as everything else. The light eye variant was never purely European property that the rest of the world borrowed. It was part of the shared human inheritance from the start, and its homeland, like everyone's, was Africa. So when it appears in a black person, it is not necessarily a visitor from outside the family at all. It may be a piece of the oldest African inheritance there is, coming home. And this is where modern DNA does something genuinely remarkable, something no legend and no old family story could ever do. It can usually tell the two apart. When geneticists read a genome, they can trace each segment of a chromosome to the part of the world it most likely came from, painting the DNA, stretch by stretch, as African or European or otherwise. So they can look at the specific piece of chromosome 15 that carries your eye color switch and ask where that piece, in particular, came from. If the light eye variant sits inside a long stretch of DNA painted European, it most likely arrived through admixture, the legacy of that harder history. If it sits inside a stretch painted African, then it is part of your African inheritance, owing nothing to any European ancestor. The same trait, two completely different origins, and the genome can frequently tell you with real confidence which one is written into you. That is the difference between a fairy tale and a fact. A fairy tale gives everyone the same flattering answer, while the DNA gives each person their own true one. Quick pause, because this is exactly the kind of question this channel exists to answer honestly, with real genetics and real history, and without the flattering myths or the cheap pandering that fills the rest of the internet on a subject like this one. There are whole corners of social media built on telling black viewers comfortable fairy tales about secret bloodlines and lost royal ancestry because flattery gets clicks. This channel does the opposite. It gives you the documented truth, even when the truth is harder than the legend, because the truth is the only thing that actually holds up, and the only thing that actually respects you. If that is the version you want, subscribe and stay for the rest. Now let me be careful and precise about the limits of all this, because the honest answer has real edges that the legends never admit to. This is the part that demands honesty, because eye color is more complicated than any single clean story, flattering or not. First, eye color is not one gene with one clean answer. It is polygenic, governed mainly by that big OCA2 and HERC2 dimmer switch, but fine-tuned by a whole committee of other genes with names like SLC, 24A4, and TYR. That complexity is why two brown-eyed parents can have a green-eyed child, why siblings can land at different points on the dial, and why Hazel in particular is so famously changeable, seeming to shift with the light, the clothing, even the mood, and sometimes drifting in shade across a person's lifetime. Hazel is not a fixed color so much as a balance point, and a balance point can tip. There is no single hazel-eyed gene you can point to like a name on a map, and there is no DNA test that prints out a one-word origin story for your eyes. What the science honestly gives you is the mechanism and the most probable sources, not a certificate of authenticity, and not the single dramatic sentence the legends always promise. Second, the real answer is genuinely mixed, and it differs from one person to the next. For one black family, those hazel eyes may trace to European admixture and the hard history behind it. For another, they may come from deep African variation, with no recent European ancestor involved at all. For a smaller number, they may come from a specific genetic condition, such as Waardenburg syndrome, that lightens the eyes on its own. There is no universal answer that fits every face. The only way to learn which story is truly yours is to look at your own ancestry in detail, and this is the one place a DNA test genuinely earns its keep, because by reading whether the chromosome surrounding those eye color genes is of African or European origin, a careful ancestry analysis can often tell you which of those paths your particular eyes travel to reach you. Third, and this is the part that matters more than any of the genetics, light eyes are not better, and they are not a badge of anything. The whole myth that hazel or light eyes make a black person special, elevated, or descended from royalty is not a harmless bit of fun. It grows directly out of colorism, the toxic hierarchy handed down from slavery and white supremacy that trained people to rank blackness by how near it sat to whiteness, prizing lighter skin and lighter eyes and straighter hair as if they were marks of higher worth. A story that treats light eyes as proof of superior ancestry is simply that same old poison poured into a flattering new bottle. The real truth, that light eyes are nothing more than melanin, physics, and the particular accidents of one family's history, is the answer that actually frees you from that hierarchy rather than crowning you inside it. What survives every caveat is this: your eyes are not a fairy tale and not a flaw. They are a true record of where your specific ancestors actually came from. So let's bring it home, because under the genetics, there is something here far better than the legend ever offered. The myth promised you a secret crown, a lost royal bloodline hidden in the color of your eyes, proof that you were quietly descended from someone grander than the ordinary run of people. The truth offers you something more real, and if you let it be, far more powerful. An honest account of your own ancestors, exactly as they were. For many black Americans, those hazel eyes carry the memory of the slave South, of European ancestry forced into the family line by a brutal system, of a child born to an enslaved woman who had no say. That history is painful, but it is yours, and it deserves to be known and named rather than papered over with a comfortable fantasy that erases the people who actually lived it. For others, those same eyes are a window onto the sheer genetic depth of Africa itself, the continent that holds more human variation than all the rest of the world together. Light eyes, and every other variation included, owing nothing to anyone outside it. And for every single person who carries them, they are a small daily reminder of the oldest truth there is, that the entire human family and every eye color it has ever produced walked out of Africa together at the very beginning of the story. That is where your hazel eyes really come from. Not from a myth handed to you to make you feel chosen, and not from a flaw to be quietly explained away, but from melanin and scattered light, from the real and often hard history of your own particular family, and from the deep African roots that every human being alive on the planet shares. The legend wanted to hand you a borrowed crown and call it your birthright. The DNA gives you something better and truer. It gives you back your actual ancestors, the ones who survived, the ones who endured, the ones whose real story is written in the mirror every morning. And that story never needed dressing up in someone else's gold because it was always, already more than enough.